Because Barclay, having decided to fight, picks this position at a place called Zaryovo Zemisha.
I stand no chance of being able to say that.
Barclay decides, this is a decent enough position. It's well protected, and I've got a clear line of sight to the enemy, so I'm not going to have any surprises. And it's funny because that's why Barclay says it's a great piece of terrain. Paskevich in his memoirs says the terrain was bad because there was a massive big field in front of us, and the French cavalry could very easily charge at us. Swings and roundabouts. But in any case, Barclay was convinced that it was a brilliant position. Everyone's sort of preparing for battle, and the rank and file are pretty happy. Finally, we have another chance to have a crack at Napoleon again.
The Russian army has been somewhat reinvigorated by 1812. They have new rules, reforms, new uniforms, and a new system of staff and officer communication, essentially. A lot hasn't changed. They still love their bayonets. They still love to attack. They still cannot really be moved unless you annihilate them from the rear.
And the word retreat has always been anathema to the Russian soldier.
Yes, so
which
they
is
hate
why...
this right now.
Yes, right. They're not very happy, They weren't happy when they retreated from Vilnius. They weren't happy when they retreated from Drissa. They weren't happy when they retreated from Vitebsk. They weren't happy when they retreated from
Actually, Barclay is facing morale disintegration at this stage as well.
He's not a very popular man.
No.
among his own people. So on the one hand, he may actually think, there's a decent chance of winning, or at least not losing.
I'm sure.
But on the other hand, he wants to keep morale and make sure that the army doesn't disintegrate, because at this point, not only is the rank and file not particularly happy, a lot of his generals, including his chief of staff, are basically plotting actively against him. Essentially, he wants to basically say, I'm not a coward, I'm not a traitor, I do want to fight. And this is proof I'm going to fight here. We're going to, give Boney a bloody nose. Oh. And which may or may not have happened. But we never know, because who turns up but the big man, Mikhail Illarionovich Golenichev Kutuzov, His Serene Highness Prince Kutuzov, who has been appointed Supreme Commander of the Russian armies, of the Russian field armies, by the Tsar. Because, essentially, after Smolensk, there was no longer enough support at court and indeed within the army for Barclay to continue serving as de facto commander-in-chief. And everyone wanted someone to be commander-in-chief. Eventually, it was given to Kutuzov because, despite being old and fat, he was also, for symbolic value and morale value alone, it was so important.
It was the living embodiment of Russian military sort of spirit.
Yeah, and because he was one of the older veterans, he was a link to the times of Suvorov and Catherine the Great.
And as we said in the previous video, the rank and file loved Kutuzov.
Initially, he says, "Okay, Barclay, we can fight at Tsaryovo Zamisha. You picked a very good terrain. Very happy with what you're doing. Continue your preparations." And then on the second day, he's just like, there are a few problems.
Don't really like it anymore.
There's a bit of wood over there where, maybe the French can hide some people, maybe surprise there. And on the other hand, we still want some reinforcements. General Mirolovich has 150,000 men. We want him with us, which means we need to retreat a bit further so he can catch up. So yeah, we should retreat. And Barclay does not take this well. He's just like, I mean, like, you agreed. You said, continue with all the preparations. We've been busy preparing, and now you're basically saying, oh, forget it. Yeah, this is because Kutuzov's staff didn't want Barclay to share the glory of having chosen the terrain, and therefore decided that, okay, we can move to we have to pick new terrain that we have chosen ourselves. So you don't have to share it with that German. And Barclay basically writes that the army was wandering around like a headless chicken, not really sure where to go, where to find a better position. And eventually they arrive at a place called Borodino.
And they came to a place called Borodino. What is this place? What is this magical place?
At said place called Borodino, which is around 10 kilometers, 10 miles-ish from to the west of the city of Mozhaisk, town or city, Russian word is the same, and it's about 90 to 100 kilometers from Moscow. So you're getting quite close to Moscow from now, and this is the chance to defend Moscow. This is essentially what is considered, the stand before Moscow. Mm-hmm. And that is Kutuzov's job. He's there to fight a battle against the French and to make sure that they don't end up in Moscow.
So we come to this place called Borodino, and Kutuzov and the Russians are now have been actively looking for a place to fight for a while due to politics. This is now Borodino, and if you look at a map, you'll see that for armies this size, it was always going to be some battle in this belt of land, basically.
Yeah.
Somewhere either side of there, it's going to happen.
Right.
Kutuzov has supplies coming in from good supplies coming in for his troops. Everybody's rowing to go, and this is the place he decides he's going to fight.
Yeah. So Borodino is where Kutuzov makes a stand. He takes up a pretty decent position on the south of the Smolensk road. So this is now, having been the Moscow road, it's now the Smolensk road, being the road that leads from Smolensk to Moscow. And it's a new Smolensk road because there's an old Smolensk road, which we'll get to in a moment. But this new Smolensk road is now the main road, and it's Napoleon's main axis of advance. It's a pretty strong position on the right. It's sort of anchored behind the river Kolocha, and with the river Moskva, which is the namesake of the city of Moscow, a bit further to the north, and then extends to the west towards the village of Borodino, and that's basically the sort of Russian right and center-ish. So the center is essentially anchored in and around Borodino, towards the south, really. And then you've got the left sort of extending further, and it's the left which is a problem because there's a fairly significant hill near the village of Shevardino on the Russian left, which the Russians decide to fortify in order to strengthen the left flank. And the Russians try to fortify as much of the line as possible. So they fortify Shevardino. They fortify the right really well, even though that was already a very well-defended position. I mean, the suggestion is that is where Napoleon is going to attack, and therefore that is where Kutuzov thought that Napoleon is going to attack and break through towards Moscow. So therefore, that's where he had the strongest defenses. You've got Shevardino, and then they sort of notice that actually the French could take the old Smolensk road, which is sort of further to the south. It's passable, but it's sort of grown over somewhat now. There's quite a lot of vegetation and trees and things like that. But still, it's if you can sort of cut through a bit of it, you can still get through. And that's when the Russians panic, because the Oldsmolensk Road basically goes to the south of the Shevardino redoubt, rendering like the whole Russian left
Position
flank like completely
untenable.
yeah. So at this point, they basically decide, well, what do we do? And we're not really sure. It depends on who you believe in the Russian army, because Kutuzov says that okay, we'll continue to man the redoubt, but we'll have to fold back the left into now back into close to a village called Semyonovskaya, and that's now the road. The road from Semyonovskaya is sort of running north-south. So essentially, you've now got the Russian army at a 45-degree angle, which is not the best position to take when you're trying to defend. But yeah, Kutuzov still says, okay, we'll that's going to be a second line of defense, but we'll still be at Shevardino. So we're still going to maintain a pretty heavy presence at Shevardino, and then we'll retreat if the French manage to take it. I guess we now move on to the battle for the Shevardino redoubt.
Okay.
So
we actually swapped over to the French.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yeah. So Napoleon is moving up. He's advancing against the Russians, and in fact, the Russians, because Napoleon is very close, the Russians actually detach a rearguard under General Pyotr Konovnitsyn, who basically holds them up. The advanced force of the French is under General Eugène de Beauharnais, the Viceroy of Italy, commanding his Fourth Corps, the Italians, and they're pushed back on the New Smolensk Road essentially. So essentially, they arrive towards Borodino. It's said that Shevardino, the reason why Napoleon decided to attack Shevardino immediately was because the position could direct flanking fire to the New Smolensk Road. It turns out that it's perhaps a slightly too far for that to actually happen, but that's a claim at least.
And it's sort of a rule of war that you don't want to leave too much to your flanks or rear if you're going out of position. Right. So it probably had to be taken.
So at this point, Eugene is still engaged with Konovnitsyn, and they fight all the way to Borodino village. And then more of Napoleon's people turn up. At this point, Shevardino is sort of neither here nor there. It's somewhat isolated, but the Russians can still support it if they want to. And at this moment, you've got brave General Neverovsky and his 27th Division at Shevardino. And I think you've got a few others sort of in and around the vicinity. The second combined Grenadier Division under Mikhail Vorontsov. So this is where we get the French attack on the redoubt, and the redoubt sort of changes hands 4, 5, 6 times. No one really cares. I mean, there's a lot of intense fighting, and this is the way the Russians do battle. They counterattack every time. And
take a position, they will take it back.
It is column versus column essentially. And this goes on until quite late into the night. More and more Russian troops are committed at Shevardino, and Barclay basically says, what a pointless waste of 6,000 men. And Borodino himself leads the second combined Grenadier Division on a charge. And eventually the Russians hold on, but they decide to retreat, and all of them move back to their second line at Semyonovskaya. After the Battle of Shevardino, which is considered by sort of Western French historians as kind of a prelude/separate battle, and is not sort of counted within the casualty figures of the Battle of Borodino, but the Russians consider it as part of the same battle. So that's where some of the discrepancy in casualty figures may come in. On the 5th of September, on the night, that's when the Russians abandon the redoubt at Shevardino, go back to Semyonovsk, and then Kutuzov basically decides, oh, hang on a minute, our left is looking a bit weak. We've only got a few Cossacks, militiamen defending the Old Smolensk Road. Maybe they need a bit more support. And to that end, the Third Corps under General Nikolai Tuchkov, which was initially placed in reserve nearer the right of the Russian army, has now got to march all the way across to the extreme left in the middle of the night. And this is a sort of sign of the dysfunction in the at Russian headquarters. The Kutuzov's idea is basically to get them hiding in the woods around Utitsa, the village of Utitsa, where essentially they could lay an ambush on any advancing French troops. Björnson, his chief of staff, turns up and is basically like, why are you guys hiding in woods? Like, why shouldn't you not be out in the open where we can see you? Like,
I have an artist waiting to paint you.
Essentially, like, there's no one really knows whose commands they should be, whose orders they should be listening to. Kutuzov was not really taking command of the details. He gave some general orders, and then he had his subordinates and his staff basically give the orders in his name. But also, Barclay and Bagration were doing a lot to sort of get their armies prepared and into order. Essentially, the new battle line was now, the right was still in its initial position, but now you had a kink at this great redoubt, and then it sort of went south rather than west as initially. Bagration, his extreme left, he's now got Tuchkov to extreme left, but he's still relatively vulnerable, and that's where the flèches come in. So they build them mainly on the 6th of September, so the day after Shevardino, and they're sort of V-shaped earthen fortifications, open at the back. Flèches in French means arrows, so they're sort of arrow-shaped. And there are 3 of them in front of the village of Shevardino. These fortifications, unlike the ones on the extreme right flank, are constructed by militiamen and labourers.
I've also read that militia were positioned around the edges of the Russian rear to basically look out for stragglers, wounded, and those people who are taking wounded to the rear, and therefore absenting themselves.
Yes, they've got the militia pointing bayonets or pointing pikes or whatever at people who are sort of wanting to run away. Yeah, we're basically onto the 6th of September. So there wasn't that much fighting. You had Eugene's 4th Corps basically doing some recon work. One interesting sort of point to consider is that why did the Battle of Borodino happen? It happened because both sides wanted it to happen. Historians have said that Kutuzov's deployment was all wrong. The Russian left was too weak, but really Kutuzov wanted to mass his men close to the new Smolensk Road, because that's where he believed that a potential breakthrough was most likely to happen, and he wanted to make sure that Napoleon could not get on the road to Moscow. So that's what he did. It ended up basically meaning positioning tens of thousands of Russian troops in a sort of wedge shape. It's very prone to artillery fire.
Quite exposed, very narrow battlefield in terms of width.
Yeah.
And let's talk about numbers for a second. How many men are we dealing with here?
By this point, maybe around 120. Well, again, it depends how you count them.
It's difficult, I know. But,
let's say about 120,000 Russians, and then you have maybe 20 to 30,000 militia plus irregulars, which sometimes does not include the Cossacks. And then on Napoleon's side, you probably have a similar number, around 130, 140,000 men, something like that. Napoleon has got on his extreme right, he's got Poniatowski's 5th Corps, and then he's got Davout on his 1st Corps, Ney's 3rd Corps, and Junot's 8th Corps. basically in the center. And then on the left, he's got Eugene's Fourth Corps, the Italian, and Murat with the cavalry reserve of 4 cavalry corps ready to pounce.
I think that is the plan exactly, which we can just mention now. His basic plan is to conquer the Russian front line with his infantry, get them running, and then hammer them with extraordinary amounts of cavalry.
And this is an important point, because Davout had suggested to Napoleon, let me take 50,000 men on an outflanking maneuver to go along the Smolensk road to attack the Russians on the left. Now, it was a very imaginative idea. It probably wouldn't have worked, unfortunately, because it was the middle of the night, very difficult to pass through.
There's every possibility that the Battle of Borodino would have ended up with the Russians retreating again when they found out Davout had outflanked them.
And that's the other thing. Napoleon wanted to bring the Russians to battle. Even if the outflanking maneuver succeeded, then if the Russians noticed them, then they could withdraw, and once again Napoleon would be playing whack-a-mole trying to chase the Russians.
Yeah.
So that's where we are, essentially.
And of course, facing that order of battle that you mentioned there is,
you've got the First Russian Army is basically taking up the right and the center. The right of the First Army is under the overall command of Miloradovich, and then the left is under the command of Doktorov, the Sixth Corps commander. And then you've got Bagration, basically his second army. Raevsky is actually pretty much anchoring the center now on the Grand Redoubt, which, for obvious reasons, because he was there, would later be called the Raevsky Redoubt. And then further south, you've got the Eighth Corps, and you've got Neverovsky's men on defending one of the flèches. I mean, Neverovsky, he's on the front line like all the time.
Yes, his name has come up a lot. It's absolutely astounding. He is a man of iron.
No, he's very, very tenacious. And that's essentially, the Russian line.
And basically, utter apocalypse is looming. The French sources record the eerie the night before the battle, with so many men camped out. Some Saxon officers and Polish officers talking. One of them was talking about how they just could feel the tension, because it's going to be awful. They know it's going to be awful.
And both sides had already been conducting the rites of war before. On the French side, you've got Napoleon surrounded by his marshals, showing him a newly painted portrait of his son, the King of Rome. He's basically sending a message to the marshals: you are fighting for this child as much as you are fighting for me. And then on the Russian side, you've essentially got a massive prayer, a massive religious procession with the evacuated icon of the Smolensk Mother of God being sort of carried around by priests, a lot of incense, singing, and Kutuzov riding around, getting a cheer. And
it almost embodies Russia on an ark, this icon that has been saved and is now here.
And in fact, Paskievich writes in his memoirs, I believe it was Paskievich, he writes in his memoirs, the preparations reminded of those before Kulikovo Field. Kulikovo Field took place in 1380.
There's definitely a medieval kind of reverence about the beginning of Borodino in the Russian army. Napoleon is very dismissive of this. He says, I've got them now.
Napoleon is targeting the Russian left. That is the weakest part of the Russian line. There's a bit of probing along either flank, but essentially the attack, the main attack, comes with Davout's First Corps against Bagration, and that's where Neverovsky once again plays a starring role in defending the flèches. It's where he goes on the counterattack once the flèches have been taken for the first time. This is where you get a lot of intense hand-to-hand fighting, and this is where essentially you're having a tug of war, or a rugby scrum, where you've got both sides sort of pushing up against each other, column versus counter column. And that's the problem with Borodino as well. Some people say one thing A happened before B. Some people say B happened before A, and no one really knows. And historians, it's our job to try and piece together in a sort of vague chronology
from what's left from sources.
Yeah. So no one really knows how many times the Bagration flèches were taken and how many times they were retaken. At around the third or fourth time this was going on, you've got Prince Bagration, the darling of the Russian army, the lion of the Russian army, giving his order to charge for another counterattack. And this is when he's struck on the left shin. He continues to give orders for a couple of minutes while he's still conscious, but then he basically falls off his horse.
He's not as lucky as General Neverovsky in that he takes a hit by a shell or round shot, and that is a big deal to get a limb hit by solid iron.
He does lose consciousness from having his leg shattered, and he's basically evacuated to the rear, to the medical point.
It's a huge blow in this type of a battle,
right?
Where everything is so close, and his personality would have emanated across this entire short space. Essentially, he could be everywhere.
Right, and he was in the early parts of the battle. All the Russian commanders, Bagration, Bennigsen, Barclay himself, Barclay could not be called a coward at Borodino. He was mounted on a white horse at the beginning of the battle. He was dressed in his dress uniform, all his medals glistening in the sun. Observers basically thought that he was planning to die gloriously, because you must consider his mental state at this time, having been blamed for everything, having been called a coward, a traitor, and everything. He wanted to give the ultimate statement. I am not neither a coward nor traitor. I will give my life on this battlefield in order to save Russia, in order to save Moscow.
But Bagration's down, and he sends a message to Barclay basically saying, it's up to you now.
Because Barclay is so exposed, his staff is also very exposed. A lot of them are wounded, a lot of them are killed. In the end, he only has two who are completely unscathed. And among the wounded is Colonel Livingston, Valdemar Livingston, who leaves us memoirs, which is why he's very often quoted. And he basically turns up to the medical point where he wants to get his wound dressed, and Bagration sort of spots him and says, how's the minister doing? How's Barclay doing? And essentially he says, the battle is going well. Now it's all in the hands of Barclay, and now go and look after your wounds. And Livingston sort of wrote in his recollections how sort of great-minded that Bagration could be, that he was thinking about the battle, he was thinking about Livingston's wound while, being heavily wounded himself.
Yes, he was still a general. He might have been hit, but he was still thinking my army, basically, my troops. Exactly. Unless a general in the field is evacuated from the field, his first thought is a good general, and he was a good general. Must be for the army. And so
he loved them, and they loved him back.
And so it is a very tragic and heroic moment that we're talking about here, because he does not ultimately survive, and he does not rejoin the battle, and things get very hairy on the left flank.
So Bagration's out of the battle. Actually, at this point, the Second Army already think he's dead, and they start wavering. And bear in mind that by this point, you've already had a fairly significant movement on the extreme left, on Tuchkov's side, which has basically led Tuchkov to abandon the village of Utitsa and retreat to the Utitsa kurgan. A kurgan is like a mount. It's used to describe a medieval burial mound. It's also used to describe landforms which are shaped like medieval burial mounds. So one is not entirely sure whether it is actually a medieval burial mound or just something which looks like one.
But he's there.
He's there. And it's a fairly decent defensive position, high ground and everything. So this is Poniatowski first, followed later by Junot, because Poniatowski is actually quite successful, having got through Utisa. A gap opens between Poniatowski and Davout, which could be exploited. So Napoleon basically orders Junot to plug the gap. So now Junot is basically joining Poniatowski in pressing against the extreme left. And Tuchkov, having already detached half of his force, is now under serious pressure. You've got reinforcements from the extreme right, the Second Corps under Bagavout, which sort of goes all the way. It takes them 2 hours, but eventually they make it to reinforce the left flank, the extreme left flank, having previously been assigned to Bagration sector.
Because they're being hammered at the second, really heavily hammered. Ney and Davout are really, really, really pressing against the flèches. Yeah. And obviously that means, with obviously Bagration down, their focus is the flèches and not the extreme left flank of Tutitsa, which obviously is now, poor old Tuchkov is now ridiculously outnumbered, and he's not going to really be able to do much except hold his ground, because everybody is needed to hold the flèches together against Ney and Davout.
Including 3 Guards regiments, which are committed very early on in the battle, which is never a good sign. And then on the Russian center, you've got Eugene's corps moving up against the Neverovsky redoubt, and that's where you have a large assault, which comes at around the same time, if not slightly after the first assault on the flèches. Essentially, a massive wall of French soldiers come marching up against the Russian position, and the Russians are being bombarded by not so much a grand battery, but Napoleon, I believe, has managed to get together about 150 guns to just bombard that position. So Paskiewicz's 26th Division could no longer hold on, so they fall back. It's at that point when the French sort of roll in and take control. And this is a pivotal point of the battle, because obviously the anchor of the Russian position, like the Neverovsky redoubt, is on this. It's basically the point of the Russian wedge. To lose that would be rather catastrophic at this point in the battle. So you've got 2 young Russian generals, General Alexei Yermolov, who is chief of staff to Barclay. He is inspecting. Well, he's going to the left to find out what's going on with Bagration and how many reinforcements he needs, because he needs a lot. And he is joined by General Kutaisov, the commander of the artillery. And they see this terrible thing happening. Okay, we need some men to retake the redoubt. They each sort of find a few thousand men from Doktorov's 6th Corps, and both of them lead a column into the fray, one going on the left, one going on the right, trying to envelop the redoubt. And within about 10 minutes, the Russians just completely overthrow the French and kick them out of the redoubt. And Yermolov estimates 3,000 men are put out of action.
That is the level of attrition we're talking about. I can read the quote in Zamoyski's book. According to one source, the French artillery fired off 91,000 rounds. According to another, they fired only 60,000, while the infantry and cavalry discharged 1,400,000 musket shots. But even that averages out at 100 cannon shots and 2,300 rounds of musketry per minute.
Immense rate of fire.
Highly exposed armies.
Yeah, let's be clear here. This is 19th century warfare, so most of these shots would have missed. But still, the minority that hit did a lot of damage.
It did a lot of damage. There was one French cavalry officer, Saxon Corps possibly, that said that he lost half of his squadron without even going into action.
Right.
So.
And this was happening on both sides. The Russian position was extremely exposed. You had reserves, within range of fire,
all stacked up behind each other.
Exactly, and the young artillery officer Avram Norov writes in his memoirs that we were were essentially, despite being reserved, was still being hit, but everyone was just sort of trying their best to remain stoic and while everything was going on. And there's one incident where you had a shell take off a guy's hand, and he's sort of running around waving his stump, shouting sort of, my hand, my hand. And then his commanding officer turns to him and says, what about your hand? Look at Usov over there. The impact has been a lot harder on him, and he's lying with his face to the ground, dead.
Oh dear.
Basically just sort of points out this is the sort of humor we had in the artillery at this point. And without that, how could you go on?
With enough sources, you read about these sort of incidents in all battles, whether it's the British or the French or the Russians or the Prussians. They all have this 19th century humor about what's happening.
Right.
So, and that's how they deal with it. We're right in the thick of the redoubt here. It changes hands how many times?
I mean, not too many actually, because
compared to the Fleisches, it's
right.
not.
Yeah. Because you've got the first attack, which is pushed back, and then at this point the Russians consolidate control with Likhachev's 24th Division, which comes to reinforce. But during this immensely successful Russian charge, unfortunately, there is one major casualty, and that is General Kutaisov, who at this point is late 20s, so quite young, very popular with the ladies in St. Petersburg. He's an accomplished poet, popular among literary circles and salons and everything. And no one really knows what happened to him. Eyewitnesses later saw his horse galloping around, bloodied, bereft of its rider, and they came to the conclusion that Kutaisov had basically been sort of torn apart into smithereens.
He most likely died and was either just buried in dead men or was so badly hit by canister or a shell that he just was no longer identifiable. Yeah. And so that has a big effect on the ability of the Russians to control their artillery.
I mean, Kutaisov gives the artillerymen general orders before the battle, but not really where to find the ammunition. And also, it would be Kutaisov's job to decide when to bring up the reserves.
No one knows what's happened to him. They can't replace him.
After a while, once they sort of realize, well, it's probably not going to come back, Yermolov temporarily tries to bring the artillery into order, but by this point it's already quite late in the battle, and a lot of the artillery is not committed, and those which are committed run out of ammunition. And at this point, the French have their opportunity.
So if I'm reading this right, their opportunity is to get across the Fleisches and then turn to their left, push north towards the rivers, basically.
Towards the river, and bear in mind, that is the rear of the Russian right flank, due to the way.
Yes, I see. Yeah.
So you may get this sort of enveloping double envelopment happening if the Russians are not too careful. So at this point, the Russians are in dire straits. Once Bagration's gone, Kononitsin tries to bring things to order in that sector with limited success, let's say. And Kutuzov has asked Doktorov to take command of the Second Army. It takes him a bit of time to get there, but he eventually does get there. And he's not a particularly sort of brilliant or flamboyant soldier, but he's dependable. He's solid. And he does a decent job of bringing the men into order, so they retreat parallel to their original line to the east. And the reason that Doktorov has the opportunity to do this is because on the northern flank, you have a big occurrence which did not seem so big initially. Before the battle started, you had the Cossacks who were essentially on the extreme Russian right, prancing about trying to find a ford to cross the Kolocha-Moskva rivers in order to give themselves the opportunity to launch a cavalry attack on the French left if it were needed. And initially, the idea is to use it as a diversionary raid. And Platov goes up to Kutuzov, requests, on a couple of occasions, can I do this? And Kutuzov's like, no, you guys are meant to be in reserve. Platov convinces Karl Wilhelm von Toll, the quartermaster general of the First Army, who basically gets on board with the idea and basically says, hang on a minute, rather than just a diversionary raid, why not have some regular cavalry with you in the form of Uvarov's first corps? Toll goes up with Platov up to Kutuzov, who's on his observation point at Gorky. He doesn't expect a huge amount from it, but because Toll has basically said this is going to be a large demonstration, Kutuzov's basically saying, fine, go and see what happens. So Platov's Cossacks and Uvarov's regular cavalry, altogether, not that many men, like maybe like 8,000 at most, 10,000 altogether. They go sort of careering round Eugene's left, and it just leads to complete chaos within the French ranks as everyone just sort of shouts, Cossacks, Cossacks!
They're the great bogeymen of the French army. Even at this stage, after all this time, the French are very well aware that the Cossacks are bad news, and their reputation is just far and beyond above what the French think they're capable of. And so if the Cossacks are in our rear, that is just bad. We have to stop everything, and we have to fix this.
Because the Cossacks were actually threatening Eugene's baggage train. Uvarov took a more sort of shallow turn, and therefore he was sort of closer to the center, and he tried to take a couple of villages from Eugene. The French, psychologically impacted by this demonstration, essentially spent 2 hours trying to get the Cossacks to go away. Valuable time for the Russians to regroup.
Yeah, it wasn't difficult for them to chase the Cossacks off, but it took a long time to gather everybody together to do it, and then gather everybody to go back.
Right.
And one of the few things Napoleon did, because he was actually just sitting around, like Kutuzov.
Yeah. He was sitting around at Borodino, which is where Napoleon's command post was at. And he basically, having heard about the Cossacks, because he was just about to launch another assault, major assault. Having heard about the Cossacks, he was like, stand down. We need to deal with this. And it's said he basically diverts like 36 battalions or something to try and put out the fire on his left flank, which is overcompensation. The Russian cavalry had no infantry support. They had 2 horse artillery units. They couldn't do much. And the Cossacks were very active. I mean, they're lighter than light cavalry. But all the same, Napoleon basically sort of sends a bunch of men to reinforce Eugene, and they do successfully push back the Russian cavalry, because they're under orders. The moment we sort of encounter any fierce resistance, just get the hell out of here.
But it cost Napoleon 2 hours, and he once said, "I can give you anything but time."
And Kutuzov, let's talk about Kutuzov, because he was really disappointed at the failure of this action, because he was under the impression that it would have been this hammer blow which would have allowed the Russians to sort of push through on the right and win a glorious victory or something. After the battle, he basically abused Platov and Uvarov and did not recommend them for any promotions or any. He was just really annoyed at them.
Very rich of him, isn't it?
And it was only later, perhaps as a result of talking to captured French soldiers or whatever, that they found out that essentially they had cost Napoleon 2 hours.
And essentially saved the Russian army.
Yeah, because this was the point when Napoleon had the opportunity to push through towards to the north and just completely annihilate the Russians, a scale of Austerlitz. But instead of that, the Russians were able to retreat within reasonably good order eastwards and parallel to their original lines, and therefore take up position on slightly higher ground, and therefore essentially present themselves again as a wall of infantry against the the French. So Napoleon had lost his opportunity to make the breakthrough, and this is where we get to the point where Napoleon is running very low on infantry, and he only really has the cavalry left to try to make any sort of decisive breakthrough.
Because he will not commit the guard.
He will not commit the guard, and it's been debated sort of endlessly over the decision. And instead of the guard, he decides to take the redoubt using horses, which is, let's say, unconventional.
Somewhat.
And by this point, the battery had been battered, and the fortifications, which were not in a great state at the beginning of the battle, were essentially, just crumbling by the end. And it was a fairly gentle slope, really, to go up. So it's not entirely ridiculous to send cavalry to take the position. And they do, rather successfully, as it turns out. Unfortunately, in the process of doing so, their commander, Auguste de Caulaincourt, was a younger brother of Napoleon's master of the horse, Armand de Caulaincourt, had previously been his minister in St. Petersburg, who had warned him about all the all the risks of going into Russia, who tried to dissuade him. Young Auguste de Caulaincourt gets himself killed.
And the death of Caulaincourt at the head of his troops, storming the Great Redoubt, is just a minuscule amount of the horrendous casualties the French cavalry take in achieving this objective.
Yes. Achieving the objective itself was actually fairly successful, accepting Caulaincourt's demise. But as cavalry are wont to do, once they successfully take a position, they decide to continue charging.
Indeed, because it is a maxim of warfare in this time, cavalry can take a position, but they cannot hold it. They can only hold it by attacking again.
I mean, the Russians at this point, they were formed up in a decent line, but they were running very low as well on infantry. And it was really artillery which was doing a lot of the legwork in terms of defensively, in terms of firing canister into attacking troops, whether infantry or horses. And every now and then you had cavalry charges also trying to essentially allow the infantry to have some respite. Essentially, the cavalry charge, actually, some of them managed to break and charge behind or around the Russians. Unfortunately, the Russians have cavalry of their own, and Barclay de Tolly uses them to very good effect.
They counterattack with their cavalry, and there's a massive melee.
So the Russians are out. The Russian cavalry is outnumbered, but they are fresh troops. So they managed to prevail in the end. It's a very, very intense cavalry duel. Could have gone either way. Eventually, the Russians prevail. Borodino is the graveyard of the French cavalry. They do not really recover, not in 1812, not in 1813, not in 1814, not in 1815. The French cavalry is permanently weakened as a result of the numbers of horses, not men, horses, that they lost at Borodino. I think the figure is like 35,000 horses or something like this.
It's really bad. The next year, the Russian authorities buried over 30,000 horse carcasses.
Right.
Or disposed of them.
Both sides.
Yes, presumably both sides. So that's a really just probably a fraction then. So this roughly saves the Russian army a second time.
Essentially, we're sort of winding down.
Yes, we have reached essentially the end of the battle.
Not much happens, but there's still artillery fire exchanged.
Yes.
The guns fall silent around sort of 8 p.m. So the cavalry duel is probably around 5, but both sides are exhausted. So they're essentially just bombarding each other. Both sides, they fall back to their initial positions effectively. So, well, as they fall back, the Russians actually sort of advance to their initial position. So So no one has really won the battle.
The field is still contested.
And indeed, there is the expectation from both sides that battle will renew the following day. And that is what Kutuzov tries to get his men to believe when essentially Barclay's staff officer turns up to Kutuzov, gives him the report of the battlefield casualties and everything. And then Kutuzov basically says, this is completely ridiculous. We won a great victory. We're gonna push them off the following day. What is this nonsense? Barclay was preparing for battle the following day because that's what Kutuzov had ordered. He said, your reports are nonsense. Continue fighting. So Barclay was like, fine, And to be fair, I think Barclay thought that there was a decent chance that the Russians could continue fighting. The Russians still had some guards, obviously, and Napoleon still had his guards.
They could have gone at it again the next day, but who knows what would have happened, to be honest.
Indeed.
The upshot is that at the end of the Battle of Borodino, massive amounts of people had been killed. The Russians, I believe, lost more men.
Yes, the casualty figures are contested, but it's probably in the region of 40,000 for the Russians and 30,000 for the French. That was killed and wounded and missing. But
of course, the French had essentially lost their cavalry force in doing this.
So Kutuzov basically lost a third of his army, and Napoleon's lost about a quarter. So neither side have come out of it particularly well. But due to the fact that Kutuzov has suffered heavier losses, he decides to retreat back towards Moscow in order to fight another battle, essentially in front of the walls of Moscow.
And so that is the end of the cataclysmic Battle of Borodino. So the Russians are withdrawing again to the walls of Moscow, and the expectation is, perhaps doggedly, perhaps reluctantly, that another battle is going to have to be fought. Perhaps, in fact, that is the ultimate expectation at this time, I think, that another battle will have to be fought, and that Napoleon. And I don't know what on earth is going on in Napoleon's headquarters at this time, but he, I think, is writing proclamations of a great victory. Both generals are proclaiming victory.
Both generals proclaim victory after Borodino, while but Kutuzov proclaimed victory, and they said, "Oh, by the way, we have fallen back again." And
circumstances beyond my control. There's the road to Damascus, and now there is the road to Philly.
Indeed.
And destiny is going to be met at Philly, where Moscow will either be defended or abandoned.